This is incredible. Today we have 36,000 objects in space that are bigger than 10 centimeters. Among them, 30,000 are cataloged and 6,000 are not referenced. This is said by Bill Nelson, the administrator of NASA, during a hearing before the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation on March 23, 2022. And it's quite amazing. In fact, he says there's about 128 million objects in space that are bigger than a sesame seed. So this means that out of these 36,000 big objects, roughly about 30,000 are cataloged and 6,000 are not referenced. There are also about 270 million objects between 0.03 and 0.07 centimeters in size. All of this sounds like science fiction, but it is reality. And if we add to this the mass of all these objects in orbit around Earth, they weigh a little bit more than the Eiffel Tower. In fact, the total mass of objects in orbit in space around Earth is 13,186 tons. A little bit more than the weight of the Eiffel Tower, which weighs 10,100 tons. It is incredible. So if you think about this, we have today almost 30,000 satellites in space orbiting our planet. But there are also a lot of debris that are up there from old rocket launches, or other kind of missions, or even disintegration of satellites. And also we have the International Space Station. We have Starlink satellites. We have lots of satellites from different countries, communication satellites, navigation satellites, and so on and so forth. We have also launched the James Webb Space Telescope and many, many other things. And all of these objects, together with their masses, add up to a little bit more than the weight of the Eiffel Tower. Incredible. This also brings us to another problem that we have in space, and that is the space junk or space debris. There are millions of pieces of space debris ranging in size from a millimeter to several meters, and they are orbiting our planet at an altitude of about 200 kilometers above the surface of Earth. These are objects that were left in space by humans. They are no longer functional. They are not being used for any purpose, and they are just there in space. And some of them are cataloged, and others are not. Some of them are easy to track because they are big enough, and others are very difficult to detect because they are very small, and they are only a few millimeters in size. But these small ones, a few millimeters in size, are actually the most dangerous because they are moving very fast, and when they hit a satellite, they can make a hole. One single millimeter object traveling at 8 kilometers per second, which is the speed of most satellites in low Earth orbit, has the same impact as a .25 caliber bullet. This is why we have millions of pieces of space debris in space that are really dangerous for our activities in space. In fact, every day, the International Space Station has to maneuver to avoid space debris. Just imagine that a piece of debris of only 1 millimeter in size can make a hole in the hull of the spaceship, and it can let in the deadly vacuum of space, or it can damage the equipment, and so on and so forth. This is why we have to be aware of what is happening in space and why we need to clean up space. And this is exactly what the company Astroscale is trying to do. Astroscale is a company that is specialized in cleaning up space debris. They have developed a system that can capture and deorbit space debris. The system consists of two main parts, an orbiter and a skydog. The orbiter is a spacecraft that remains in orbit, and it is equipped with a robotic arm that can capture and manipulate space debris. The skydog is a small probe that can enter the Earth's atmosphere and burn up like a shooting star. In order to clean up space debris, the orbiter first identifies a target piece of debris, and then it uses its robotic arm to capture it. Once the debris is captured, the orbiter fires its thrusters to initiate the deorbiting process. The debris and the spacecraft will re-enter the Earth's atmosphere together, and they will burn up in the process. This is how Astroscale's system works, and they have just signed a contract with the European Space Agency to clean up a set of old satellites that are in orbit. The cleanup operation will take place in 2025, and it will involve removing 3 satellites from orbit, a Vega, a Sentinel, and a Columbus. These satellites are no longer operational, and they have been in orbit for over 20 years. It's time to bring them home. The contract with ESA is the first commercial agreement for Astroscale, and it shows that the company's technology is mature and ready for prime time. It also shows that there is a growing demand for space cleanup services. In fact, ESA is not the only customer that is interested in this. Other space agencies and private companies are also in talks with Astroscale to remove their space debris. We have talked about this in previous episodes, and it is great to see that finally someone is doing something about it. All right, let's carry on with the quote from Bill Nelson. He says, "There are about 128 million objects in space that are bigger than the sesame seed. That's just what we know about." He says, "We know it's much more than that. We don't know how much more." He also says that the reason why they don't know exactly how many objects are in space is that they would have to send thousands of ground-based radars to look all around the world and then go into space to look in all directions. This is obviously not possible, so they can only estimate the number of objects in space based on the data that they have available. But he says, "We know it's much more than 128 million. We don't know how much more." This is quite amazing, and it makes you realize how much we still have to explore in space. We have barely scratched the surface. We have only explored a tiny fraction of the universe, and there is so much more out there that we don't know about. And now, we have 30,000 objects in space that are cataloged, and we know where they are, and we have 6,000 objects that are not cataloged. So they are not referenced. They are probably too small to be detected, but they are still in space. It is also interesting to note that the number of objects in space is constantly growing. Every year, hundreds of new satellites are launched into orbit, and they join the growing number of objects in space. This is because more and more countries and companies are using satellites for various purposes, such as communication, navigation, Earth observation, and so on and so forth. For example, SpaceX alone has launched thousands of Starlink satellites into orbit, and other companies are planning to launch even more satellites in the future. One of the most ambitious projects is Amazon's plan to launch 3,236 satellites into orbit. This will be part of Amazon's Project Terra, which aims to provide high-speed internet access to even the most remote areas of the world. So we are going to see more and more objects in space in the future, and this will also increase the risk of space debris. This is why it is so important to have systems in place to track and monitor space debris. For example, ESA has a space surveillance and tracking program that keeps track of more than 120,000 objects in space. The program uses ground-based telescopes and radars to track these objects, and it provides data to the European Space Operations Center, which is responsible for ensuring the safety of space operations in Europe. So it is good to know that there are organizations that are working hard to keep track of everything that is happening in space. However, it is not enough to simply track space debris. We also need to find ways to remove it. This is where Astroscale and other companies like it come in. By developing technologies to clean up space debris, these companies are helping to ensure that space remains a safe and sustainable environment for all humankind. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about this? Do you think it is amazing that we have so many objects in space today? Or do you think it is a bit scary? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this episode, I would appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.